Gay's words, years later, still retain something of the desperation he must have felt after he watched the last two other planes go down. My target, which I think was the Kaga, was now in a hard turn to starboard, and I was going toward its forward port quarter. I figured that by the time a torpedo could travel the distance, it should be in the water, the ship should be broadside. I aimed about 1/4 of the ship's length ahead of its bow, and reached out with my left hand to pull back the throttle. It had been calculated that we should be at about 80 knots when we dropped these things, so I had to slow down. I was simply trying to do what I had come out to do. When I figured that I had things about as good as I was going to get them, I punched the torpedo release button. Nothing happened. Damn those tracers, I thought. They've goofed up my electrical release and I'm getting inside my range. I had been told that the ideal drop was 1,000 yards range, 80 knots speed, and 80 feet or so of altitude. But by the time I got the control stick between my knees and put my left hand on top of it to fly the plane and reached across to pull the cable release with my good right hand, I was into about 850 yards. The cable, or mechanical release, came out of the instrument panel on the left side, designed to be pulled with the left hand. But those damn zeros had messed up my program. My left hand did not work. Anyhow, it was awkward, and I almost lost control of the plane trying to pull out that cable by the roots. I can't honestly say I got rid of that torpedo. It felt like it. I had never done it before, so I couldn't be sure, and with the plane pitching like a bronco, I had to be content with trying my best. Okay, so I've gotten rid of the GD torpedo. Now what do I do? In a moment, Gay was in the water, hiding under the seat cushion that he had saved from the wreckage of his plane, just as Waldron had told him to save everything because you could never tell when it would come in handy. On board the Enterprise, an unfortunate chain of circumstances, as Murray called them in his after-action report, began when his dive bombers departed alone on a course that would take them south of the Japanese for a time. The chain continued when the 10 VF-6 fighters, led by Lieutenant Jim Gray, followed the wrong Torpedo Squadron, Torpedo 8, to the target, and then circled at 20,000 feet, apparently unaware of the slaughter taking place below him. At 10:10, after his charge, the real Torpedo 6 had arrived on the scene and begun its attack. Gray reported back to the Enterprise that he had had an uneventful flight and, being short of gas, was returning to base. In that message, he finally located the Japanese fleet and described it, something he should have done an hour before when he first saw it. His was by no means the only communication failure that day, and the American admirals after the Catalina sighting reports operated with minimal information about the location of the enemy. The Enterprise torpedo planes, Vermont, 6, commanded by the handicapped Lindsay, flew alone on a course that brought them in 30 miles south of the carriers. They turned north, breaking into two sections for an anvil attack on Kaga at 10:20. They encountered the first ring of defense ships about 10 miles out, and the anti-aircraft fire became heavier as the inner defense ring picked them up at 5 miles. By then, the Zeros were among them and began shooting them down. They continued to close in, but as they did so, their target turned to starboard, keeping its quarter to the planes. This dance of death was sketched, see Fig. 9, by Lieutenant Laub, the senior survivor of the squadron, making clear how the manoeuvring of the ships kept the torpedo planes circling, trying vainly, at their slow speed, to get in position to turn in for a broadside run from close enough to be able to launch their torpedoes at an angle of less than 70 degrees. But Laub says, the ship's turns were so timed that it was impossible to obtain an advantageous point from which to drop. All this time, of course, the Torpedo 6 planes were being shot down by the Zeros and battered by the anti-aircraft fire. The Enterprise dive bombers arrived as its surviving torpedo planes were clearing the area. Of the 14 Torpedo 6 planes, only 5 survived, one of which, flown by machinist Albert W. Winchell, crashed in the water on the way back from the attack. First reported as a casualty, he was picked up with his radio man 17 days later, both unharmed but many pounds lighter. The 12 planes of the Yorktown Torpedo Squadron, Vermont, 3, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, accompanied by 6 fighters, arrived at 10:15, 20-25 miles out, while Torpedo 6 was still engaged. The Zeros soon came at them, announcing that they were there for business by dropping their belly tanks through the few escort Wildcats. The Yorktown group had arrived in a bunch, and the dive bombers of Bombing 3 began attacking the Soryu at once. But Massey, rather than taking advantage of this diversion, chose to lead his torpedo planes, followed by a swarm of Zeros, toward the Hiryu, which was moving off alone toward the north, unseen and unattacked by the dive bombers. One can only speculate, but Massey, faced with a difficult attack problem, must have felt confident that his torpedo planes with their 6 fighter escorts could take care of the 4th carrier on their own, lest it escape, as it eventually did. Later, its planes crippled the Yorktown. Massey's own fighters soon left him after losing 1 plane and being overwhelmed by the Zeros. After that, the Zeros chewed at their leisure on Torpedo 3. Wilhelm G. Doc Esders, an enlisted chief aviation pilot, was one of only 2 pilots from the 12 Torpedo 3 TBDs to survive this attack. His after-action report provides a forceful account of what it was like to fly out to the Japanese carriers, attack, and then make his way back with a damaged plane and a dying radioman. We sighted 3 dense columns of smoke to our northwestward, distance about 20 to 25 miles, at which time we changed course in that direction. We also started to climb again as we were out of the clouds. The squadron commander led the squadron to the north side of the enemy force. We were at an altitude of 2,600 feet. When about 14-18 miles from the enemy carriers, 2 Japanese fighters commenced attacking us. The squadron remained in combat formation throughout our approach. After the first attack, the squadron commander started maneuvering considerably, losing and gaining altitude slightly and increasing speed. When approximately 10 miles out, 2 more Japanese fighters joined in the fight. At this time, I was very engrossed in watching the squadron leader due to our maneuvering, and was unable to observe the ships and their movements very well. We proceeded to lose altitude and increased our speed until we were about 50 feet above the water. Several more Japanese fighters joined the engagement. 6 to 8 Japanese fighters continually made attacks during our approach. We were forced to get low before we desired to start our initial approach, therefore being at a handicap due to the lack of speed. When approximately 1 mile from the carrier our leader apparently expected to attack, his plane was hit and it crashed into the sea in flames. At the same time he was hit, I had to maneuver very violently to avoid tracer bullets from a Japanese plane. We made our final turn of our approach, and I saw another plane of our formation crash in flames. In the final stages of our attack, I saw only 5 planes drop their torpedoes. We completed our attack a few minutes after 1,000, including my own. Throughout our approach over the screen, we were under heavy AA fire, which appeared to be very ineffective, most of it bursting approximately 800 to 1,000 feet beyond the formation. In the early stages of our approach, my plane was hit by gunfire from a Japanese fighter, causing the CO2 fire bottle just forward of my knees to explode. In making our torpedo drops, we were under constant gunfire from the carrier, which appeared to be ineffective. We dropped our torpedoes between 600 and 800 yards from the target. At this time, my radio man called me over the interphone and said he was hit and would be of no further use to ward off fighter attacks. Immediately after dropping my torpedo, I turned to my right to clear the ship by several hundred yards. The other 4 planes crossed directly ahead of the bow of the carrier, one of them crashing into the sea, while fighters were still making continuous attacks on us. Due to continuous fighter attacks, I was unable to observe the torpedo tracks, or if we scored any hits. In making my retreat, I was attacked by 2 fighters immediately after I started my turn to the right. They each made 2 or 3 passes at me, then 2 other fighters came in from ahead, one from the bow and one dead ahead. At that time, I was 10 to 12 miles from the carrier we attacked. 2 more Japanese fighters started making passes at us, one from the port and the other from ahead. They continued to make passes at us until we were about 20 miles from our objective. The fighters then retired toward the Japanese fleet. Lloyd Childers, the wounded gunner for the other Torpedo 3 survivor, machinist Harry Call, describes what it was like in the back seat trying to hold off the frenzied Zero attackers. That was the beginning of the melee, with about 30 Zeros going crazy in the most undisciplined, uncoordinated attack that could be imagined. The estimate of 30 Zeros was my answer to Call a few days later when he was writing his report. I got a couple of no-deflection shots on crazy Zero pilots who were in a hell of a hurry to shoot us down. I fired about 200 rounds or 2 cans of ammo as we moved in on the target. I observed the F4Fs above us mixing it up with the Zeros. At one point, when I was not shooting at a Zero, I saw a Zero coming almost straight down, not smoking, smacking the water within 100 yards of us. So I knew the F4Fs were not losing every encounter, even though badly outnumbered. I saw other aircraft fall out of the sky, but I could not tell whether ours or theirs. I recall thinking, my God, this is just like watching a movie. Although it required some stretching by me, I tried to see what we were headed into. One look showed me 3 carriers, cruisers, and destroyers going top speed and turning. It was an awesome sight that frightened me badly. By this time, the AA fire was coming at us in multiple black puffs. Call yelled in his high-pitched voice, "Look at the skipper!" I looked to the port just in time to see the skipper's plane hit the water in flames, caused by a direct AA hit, I assumed. Childers remembers his pilot saying over the interphone, "We're not going to make it." They did, however, but could not land on the Yorktown's flight deck because of a bomb hole caused by the Japanese dive bomber attack that was progressing as they returned. His strength sapped by his wound, Childers was able to swim only a few strokes after they crash-landed in the water. But he remembers reaching up and patting the old TBD on the tail as it sank and thanking it for bringing them back. Fuchida was still on deck on the Akagi, watching Torpedo 6 and then Torpedo 3 come in. His memory of details is not perfect, but his description of the remarkable scene is told vividly and with great feeling. Again at 0930, a lookout atop the bridge yelled, "Enemy torpedo bombers, 30 degrees to starboard, coming in low." This was followed by another cry from a port lookout forward. "Enemy torpedo planes approaching 40 degrees to port." The raiders closed in from both sides, barely skimming over the water. Flying in single columns, they were within 5 miles and seemed to be aiming straight for Akagi. I watched in breathless suspense, thinking how impossible it would be to dodge all their torpedoes. But these raiders, too, without protective escorts, were already being engaged by our fighters. On Akagi's flight deck, all attention was fixed on the dramatic scene unfolding before us, and there was wild cheering and whistling as the raiders went down one after another. Of the 14 Torpedo 6 enemy torpedo bombers which came in from starboard, half were shot down, and only 5 remained of the original 12 planes, VT-3, to port. The survivors kept charging in as Akagi opened fire with anti-aircraft machine guns. Both enemy groups reached their release points, and we watched for the splash of torpedoes aimed at Akagi. But to our surprise, no drops were made. At the last moment, the planes appeared to forsake Akagi, zoomed overhead, and made to port and astern of us. As the enemy planes passed Akagi, its gunners regained their composure and opened a sweeping fire, in which Hiryu joined. Through all this deadly gunfire, the Zeros kept after the Americans, continually reducing their number. 7 enemy planes finally succeeded in launching their torpedoes at Hiryu, 5 from its starboard side and 2 from port. Our Zeros tenaciously pursued the retiring attackers as far as they could. Hiryu turned sharply to starboard to evade the torpedoes, and we watched anxiously to see if any would find their mark. A deep sigh of relief went up when no explosion occurred, and Hiryu soon turned its head to port and resumed its original course. A total of more than 40 enemy torpedo planes had been thrown against the Japanese fleet in these attacks, but only 7 American planes had survived long enough to release their missiles, and not a single hit had been scored. Nearly all of the raiding enemy planes were brought down. The torpedo attack from the American carriers was over by 10:45, having taken an hour and a half from start to finish, and costing almost all the planes and their crews. Before the water closed over the last Torpedo 6 devastators, the dive bombers from Enterprise arrived like the U.S. cavalry in a western. Wade McCluskey, CEAG, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, had flown as far west as fuel would allow without sighting the Japanese ships when, call it fate, luck, or what you may, at 0955 I spied a lone Japanese cruiser, actually the destroyer Arashi, scurrying under full power to the northeast. Concluding that it possibly was a liaison ship between the occupation forces and the striking force, I altered my group's course to that of the cruiser. At 1005, that decision paid dividends. Peering through my binoculars, which were practically glued to my eyes, I saw dead ahead, about 35 miles distant, the welcome sight of the Japanese carrier striking force. The Yorktown bombers had arrived about the same time, and between them they polished off Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Commander Tom Cheek, a Fighting 3 pilot providing defense for the Torpedo 3 planes, watched the great fleet die, taking an empire with it. As I looked back to Akagi, hell literally broke loose. First, the orange-coloured flash of a bomb burst appeared on the flight deck midway between the island structure and the stern. Then, in rapid succession, followed a bomb burst midship, and the water founts of near misses plumed up near the stern. Almost in unison, on my left, Kaga's flight deck erupted with bomb bursts and flames. My gaze remained on Akagi as an explosion at the midship waterline seemed to open the bowels of the ship in a rolling greenish-yellow ball of flame. A black cloud of smoke drew my attention to Soryu, still in a turn to starboard, as it too was being heavily hit. Dense black smoke billowed from the entire length of its hull. All 3 ships had lost their foaming white bow waves and appeared to be losing speed. I circled slowly to the right, awestruck, my mind trying desperately to grasp the full impact of what I had just witnessed, and the scene still in motion. In reading the script, the briefing team had voiced this destructive happening as only a hoped-for possibility. The infernos I now watched in creation were not being viewed from a comfortable seat in a movie, but from atop a parachute pack in a Grumman fighter. A last look in their direction found the 3 carriers now almost dead in the water. Each vessel's position was marked by a black cloud of smoke towering above, rolling and boiling in a manner indicating it rose from an area of intense heat. In the end, it was indeed a famous victory, but it cost the Torpedo Squadrons almost everything. Gay tried to salvage what he could with a belief that the destruction of Torpedo 8 diverted the Zeros and left a clear sky for the Yorktown and Enterprise dive bombers when they did finally arrive. Figuring the total loss of Torpedo 8 as a staggering blow, it must be remembered in the final figures for the day, our squadron did very well indeed. VT-8 drew down the Zeros so that the dive bombers had a better chance, and they did a magnificent job. Recent historians have justified the torpedo attacks in a different way. The deck-spotting procedures of the Japanese carriers meant that the torpedo attacks forced them to use their flight decks during the approximately hour and a half the torpedo squadrons were coming in to launch and land fighters, maintaining the maximum number of armed Zeros in the air. As a result, they could not find the 45 minutes needed to get their bombers and torpedo planes up from the hangar decks and send them out to attack the American fleet. Even the slow pace of our torpedo attacks and the staggered arrival of the squadrons, though tactical failures, maximized the time that Japanese flight decks were tied up. No one can claim credit for this critical effect, totally unintended if unrecognized for 60 years, except the air crews whose blazing courage and sense of duty flew their old planes with their defective torpedoes to a desperate end. The best-laid schemes are mice and men, gang aft agly, command failures. The poet Robert Burns put it well, and after a famous victory in which his planes were scattered all over the Pacific skies, Admiral Spruance agreed with equal rue. In reading the account of what happened on the 4th of June, I am more than ever impressed with the part that good or bad fortune sometimes plays in tactical engagements. Fuchida and Okumiya in Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, give us credit where no credit is due for being able to choose the exact time for our attack on the Japanese carriers when they were at the greatest disadvantage, flight decks full of aircraft fueled, armed, and ready to go. All that I can claim credit for myself is a very keen sense of the urgent need for surprise, and a strong desire to hit the enemy carriers with our full strength as early as we could reach them. But there were errors and failed judgments as well as luck at work at Midway, and they had a lot to do with the disaster that overtook the torpedo squadrons on June 4th. Fate began to weave its web long before the battle when the Devastators were designed, and the Zero and Wildcat came off the drawing boards. When torpedoes were not built in sufficient numbers, or tested effectively at Goat Island, when pilots were not trained to drop them because of their cost, and on, a fatal web that was completely in place by 0700 in the Pacific waters northwest of Midway Island on June 4, 1942. It can be argued that the old Devastators and their faulty torpedoes should never have been sent out on such a dangerous mission as attacking Kido Butai. Yet the answer to that would surely have to be that they were what we had, and that torpedo planes, whatever problems might have been known but not fully factored into tactical thinking, were officially considered to be ship killers, delivering the heavy knockout blows in a carrier-concerted attack. It was one I had never seen before. It looked very official. I didn't hesitate to open it. Something told me it was important. It told the sad story of my father's squadron going into battle and not returning to the carrier. Our maid called my mother's best friend with the news, and she in turn called my mother. Mother came home, and the usual telegram was there to greet her. Many of the families of the Torpedo Squadron members found it hard to believe that their loved ones were gone, and there were those like Oswald Gainier's wife, Rita, who refused for years, if ever, to believe that her husband was dead. Whitey Moore's intended wife, Betty, married another Midway aviator, Melvin Roach, who himself died in 1944 as a result of a plane crash. She never forgave Tex Gay for surviving when her intended did not, and long after the war she still, with a lot of expletives, described him as a braggart and a liar who could not be trusted. Years later, I wrote a book about life in the wartime Navy, Crossing the Line, and among the letters I received afterward, there was the following, May 15, 1996. Dear Mr. Kernan, I am the widow of John Wiley Brock, who was in your squadron at one time. He was in VT6 on the old Enterprise, and was killed in May, sick of 1942 at Midway. There is a picture of him with the squadron in your book. What I would like to know is, do you remember him? I have never found anyone who did. I would like this info for our son Jerry Allen Brock, who never knew his father. It's very important to him, and to me also. I know that all the years that have passed, dim memories. I am a classic example. But if you remember anything on a more personal level, I would greatly appreciate it. Looking forward to hearing from you, if you have the time and recollect anything about Brock. Sincerely, D. Rodriguez. I had to write back that, unhappily, I could remember little. Then a stroke of luck. I happened to mention the letter to an old shipmate, Dan Vanderhoof, who lives in Olympia, Washington. Dan knew everyone, and he just happened to have been a good friend of John Brock, who began as an enlisted naval aviation pilot, but was commissioned just before the war. How very proud he was of that uniform. A squadron beer party was held sometime in August or September of 1941 in the vicinity of Cocoa Head Beach. I took my old Eastman Kodak box camera, and among the pictures was one of John Brock. Stranger than fiction. Dan, of course, got in touch with D. Rodriguez and told her everything he could remember. She was delighted. The 7th of February, 1997. Dear Dan, what an absolute joy to receive your letter, to say nothing of the surprise. I'm at a loss for the right words to express my gratitude for you sharing your memories of John Wiley. You are the first person in all these years who has done so. While reading your letter, that feeling of déjà vu, of being transported back in time and place, came over me. Also that sense of knowing that no one ever dies, as long as they are remembered. Retelling stories and sharing experiences of our generation keeps all our lost friends and loved ones alive, even though we may have moved on long ago. We were unique, as subsequent generations have proved, in our courage, music, and being united as a country. I dropped out after President Kennedy was killed and became an expatriate, living all over the world for years. No regrets. D. Rodrigue. The search for survivors goes on still. In 1998, a National Geographic Society expedition located and filmed, 3 miles down in the Pacific Ocean, the hulk of the old Yorktown, still looking quite poised, though a bit off-centre. It had been battered by bombs and aerial torpedoes on June 4th, and then hit by submarine torpedoes that finally put it down on June 7th. But in the ocean depths, it continues to look almost fit to sail away to another battle. Its sister ship at Midway, the Hornet, sank on October 26, 1942, northeast of Guadalcanal, and after the war, the Enterprise, having gone through nearly every major engagement on the long road to Tokyo, was broken up for scrap. Its stern plate with the ship's name was salvaged and rests in a park in River Vale in northern New Jersey. Take the last exit north on the Garden State Parkway. The war ended in apocalypse, a fiery conflagration that reduced the Japanese Empire to little more than nothing. To the survivors of Midway, it should have been revenge without a shadow, but the very power of it overwhelmed, making the survivors and all the people who had died along the way, like the torpedo crews at Midway, seem small and insignificant. The way Commander Fuchida remembered them. Tiny, dark specks in the blue sky, a little above the horizon, on Akagi's starboard bow. The distant wings flashed in the sun. Occasionally one of the specks burst into a spark of flame and trailed black smoke as it fell into the water, so distant as to be only black dots bursting into flame and trailing smoke into the water. In 1992, wreaths were put in these waters to commemorate what had happened there 50 years earlier, but they floated on the ocean surface like our memories. Ensign Gay's ashes were spread on the waters, and the Yorktown was located and photographed miles down in the ocean. Later, the U.S. Navy made Midway Day, June 4th, the official commemorative day of the American Navy, like Trafalgar Day in Britain. But D. Rodriguez gets closest, I think, to the best way to rescue our vanished dead. No one ever dies, as long as they are remembered. Retelling stories and sharing experiences of our generation keeps all our lost friends and loved ones alive, even though we may have moved on long ago. It is my hope that this story of what actually happened to the torpedo squadrons at Midway will contribute something to keeping those brave men and old shipmates alive. LT-CDR E. Massey, Eliperi, ACRM. Chief Aviation Pilot, W.G. Estes, R.B. Brazier, Arm 2C, Match H.L. Call, L.E. Childers, Arm 3C, LTJG, C.W. Howard, H.L. Lundy, Jr., Arm 1C, ENS.L.L. Smith, R. Das, Arm 3C, C.H. Match, J.W. Haas, W.A. Phillips, Jr., Arm 3C, LT.P.H. Hart, J.R. Cole, Armic, ENS.D.J. Roche, C.L. Moore, Arm 3C, ENS.C.A. Osberg, R.M. Hansen, Arm 3C, LTJG, R.W. Susans, T.L. Barclay, Arm 2C, ENS.O.A. Powers, J.E. Mandeville, SEA-2C, ENS.W. Osmus, B.R. Dodson, Jr., Arm 3C, Torpedo Squadron 6, LT-CDR E. Lindsay, CT Granite, ACRM, LTJG, SL Rombach, W. Glenn, Arm 2C, ENS.E. Heck Jr., D.L. Ritchie, Arm 3C, LTJG, J.T. Eversole, J.U. Lane, RM 2C, LTJG, RM Holder, G. Durawa, Arm 3C, LT Re Laub, W.C. Humphrey Jr., Arm 1C, ENS I.H. McPherson, W.D. Horton, Arm 2C, LT A.V. Ely, R. Lindgren, RM 3C, C.H. Mech, S.B. Smith, W.N. McCoy, SEA-2C, Torpedo Squadron 8, LT-CDR, J.C. Waldron, He Dobbs, ACRM, LT-R.A. Moore, T.H. Petrie, Arm 1C, ENS W.R. Evans, Jr., Re Bibb, Jr., Arm 3C. ENS H.J. Ellison, G.A. Field, Arm 3C. LTJG, J.D. Woodson, O.D. Creasy Jr., Arm 3C. ENS W. Creamer, F.S. Polston, SEA 2C. ENS J.P. Gray, M.A. Calkins, Arm 2C. N.S. Hume Moore, Weesaw Hill, Arm 3C. LTJC Owens Jr., A. Maffey, Arm 1C. ENS H.P. Kenyon, Jr., D.L. Clark, Arm 2C. LTJG, G.M. Campbell, R.J. Fisher, Arm 2C. ENS J. Miles, Al Pico, C2C. ENS W.W. Abercrombie, B.P. Phelps, Arm 2C. ENS G.W. Teets, H. Martin, Arm 2C. ENS G.H. Gay, R.K. Huntington, Arm 3C. The torpedo plane crews from Midway, LT.L.K. Feeberling, ENS J. Wilker, R. Osborne, RM2C, ENS C.E. Brannan, W.C. Loy, AMM 3C, C.E. Fair, AOM 3C, ENS A.K. Ernest, H.H. Ferrier, Arm 3C, J.D. Manning, SEA 1C, ENS V.A. Lewis, N.L. Carr, AMM 3C, J.W. Mealtretter, EM 3C, ENS O.J. Gainier, ENS J.M. Hissam, H.W. Pitt, SEA 1C, NAP D, D. Woodside, at Moa, PTR 2C, LJ Ogeron, AOM 3C. The B-26 crews, listed by plane: 69th Bombardment Squadron, medium, 38th Bombardment Group, Capt. James F. Collins, Jr. 2nd LT Colin O. Villanis, 2nd LT Thomas N. Weems, Jr. SGT Ernest M. Mohon, Jr. SGT Jack D. Dunn, TSGT Raymond S. White, CPL John D. Joyce, 1st LT William S. Watson, 2nd LT L. H. Whittington, 2nd LT John P. Schumann, SGT James E. Vere, SSGT Richard C. Decker, CPL Albert E. Owen, CPL Bernard C. Seats, 18th Reconnaissance Squadron, medium, 22nd Bombardment Group, 1st LT James P. Murray, 2nd LT Pren L. Moore, 2nd LT William W. Moore, 2nd LT Russell H. Johnson, TSGT John J. Gogo, CPL Frank L. Mello Jr., PFC Earl D. Ashley, 1st LT Herbert C. Mays, 2nd LT Garrett H. McAllister, 2nd LT William D. Hargis, 2nd LT Gerald J. Barnacle. SSGT Salvatore Battaglia, PVT Benjamin F. Huffstickler, PVT Roy W. Walters. Chronology of American torpedo attacks at Midway. 4 torpedo groups attacked the Japanese at Midway: Torpedo Squadron 3, VT-3, on the Yorktown, Torpedo Squadron 6, VT-6, aboard the Enterprise, Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, on the Hornet, and a scratch Midway torpedo group consisting of 6 planes from a detached Torpedo 8 flying the new TBFs, plus 4 Army B-26S modified to carry a torpedo. The after-action reports that detail the timing of the attacks are not always clear or contain contradictions, but the following amalgamation of information provides the timing of the main events. 0430 Kido Butai launches half its aircraft to attack Midway. 0530 Patrol PBY from Midway radios that it has sighted Kido Butai. 0607. Fletcher orders Spruance to proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers as soon as definitely located. 0615 Midway Torpedo Group takes off. 0702 Hornet commences launching its strike. 0706 Enterprise begins launching its strike. 0710 Midway Torpedo Group attacks. 0728 Kido Butai hears Japanese scout plane, number 4 from Tone, sighted what appears to be the enemy composed of 10 ships, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, on course 150 degrees, speed 20 knots, marking the first Japanese knowledge that the American fleet is on their flank. Japanese story of the Battle of Midway, 7. Other Japanese communications copied in Appendix 2 are from the same source. 0746 Hornet completes launch, with torpedo planes being the last to take off. Hornet Air Group departs around 0755 on a course of 265 degrees. Enterprise Strike Force leaves in 3 separate groups by 0806. 0816, Torpedo 8 breaks off from Hornet Air Group to fly a course of 234 degrees. 0820 Tone Number 4 Scout reports that the enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. 0840 Yorktown launching and dispatching strike. 0855 search plane messages Kido Butai. Site 10 enemy attack, Torpedo 8 planes heading toward you. 0917 Kido Butai completes, taking aboard Midway attack units, turns northeast to 70 degrees and goes to 30 knots. 0918 Torpedo 8, 15 planes, is sighted by Kido Butai, 52 degrees to starboard, distance 21 miles. A smokescreen is laid down, and Akagi begins evasive action. 0925 Torpedo 8 attacks. 0940 Akagi sights. 14 enemy planes, Torpedo 6, in position bearing 140 degrees to port, elevation 1 degree, distance 40,000 meters. Japanese Story of the Battle of Midway, 18. Although Laub, the senior surviving officer of VT-6, states in his after-action report that Torpedo 6 was the first to attack the Japanese, it was sighted by the Japanese 22 minutes after Torpedo 8, 1,000 Torpedo 6 attacks Kaga, 10-10 fighting 6, 10 planes, radios that it has been over the enemy for an hour at 20,000 feet, and having seen no enemy fighters, is returning to Enterprise. 10-15 Torpedo 3, 12 planes, is sighted by Akagi, bearing 170 degrees to port, elevation 2 degrees, distance 45,000 meters. Japanese Story of the Battle of Midway, 19. ESDAS reported that Torpedo 3 had sighted 3 columns of smoke at 0935 to the northwest. Call, however, placed the sighting at 1,000, which is closer to the Japanese report. 1025 McCluskey and Leslie arrive with dive bombers and begin attack. 10:30. Torpedo 3 moves north to shift its target to Hiryu and begins attack. The Hornet Air Group course on the morning of June 4th. A controversy has developed over the years regarding the course Commander Stanhope Ring took with his Hornet Air Group on the first morning of the Midway battle. The plain fact is that, regardless of the route he took, he missed the enemy fleet altogether and lost nearly half of his planes. This failure was grievous, as he led 1/3 of the limited American carrier striking power that day. Had his dive bombers attacked before or with the Enterprise and Yorktown groups, the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, likely would not have survived to launch the counterattack that led to the sinking of the Yorktown. At the time the American carriers launched their strikes on June 4th, Kido Butai was located to the southwest, at about 240 degrees, 160 nautical miles, and approximately 90 minutes flying time for an air group trying to stay together for a combined strike. Without specifying the exact course, Mark Mitcher in his after-action report, Ring in his letter, and George Gay in his Sole Survivor all have the Hornet Air Group flying a southwesterly course, implying that it corresponded to the 240-degree bearing. This course is drawn on the spurious map, see Fig 10, attached to the Hornet after-action report, where no specific headings are given. Over time, however, evidence has accumulated, largely from the work of Bowen Weishaupt, suggesting that the Ring Group flew off on 265 degrees, too far north to have any chance of finding Nagumo, see Fig 11. The weight of the evidence for this course seems conclusive. The late Rear Admiral Walter Rodee, who was the skipper of Scouting 8 at Midway, reluctantly revealed in an interview with Bowen Weishaupt, Last Flight 88, that the Hornet Strike Group had flown the course written in his logbook, 265 degrees. Eyewitness testimony from the Hornet air crews agrees that Waldron turned left, not right, when he broke off, confirming that Ring was north of the Japanese carriers. One radioman in Scouting 8 dive bombers recalled, "About a half hour or so after we had all joined up in a wide scouting line, I observed VT-8 heading about 40 degrees to our port. I have no real idea of the true heading, and I mentioned to Don Kirkpatrick, my pilot, about the new heading that Waldron had taken. Richard Woodson, Waldron's course, Bombert, posting of March 4, 2004. Hornet's radar plotted a returning flight of Rodey's squadron at 260 degrees, which would make sense only if they had flown out on a heading similar to that. Unfortunately, no after-action reports exist for any of the Hornet squadrons or its air group, which is of course highly suspect in itself, since filing was mandatory. Ensign, later Captain Roy G., a pilot in VB-8 who flew on the June 4 mission, recalled that there was wide disagreement about the proper course, and that the course finally settled on, Ring's choice, did not correspond to that plotted by others. Stanhope C. Ring had his own navigation solution, as did our VB-8CO, LCDR Ruff Johnson, the VS-8CO, LCDR Walt Rodey, and the VT-8CO, LCDR John Waldron. The VF-8CO, LCDR Mitchell, remarked that he would use the solution that was chosen. The Squadron CO's solutions were different from Chag's, but he overruled them and said that Air Group 8 would fly his navigational solution. LCDR Waldron strongly disagreed. Roy G., remembering Midway. It is necessary to record, however, that more than 60 years later, one of Commander Ring's two wingmen on that fatal morning, Ensign Clayton Fisher, though not sure, remembered matters differently. I wish I could remember the initial navigational heading the Hornet dive bombers used the morning of June 4th. To my knowledge, the same estimated location of the Japanese carriers was given to all our air group commanders. I flew wing on the Hornet's air group commander. There were no navigational problems. We all had plotted in the enemy's estimated position and knew what course heading we would be flying. If Chag had decided to fly a different course than what we plotted in our ready rooms, I would have been aware of the new course. When we arrived at the estimated position of the carriers, I thought they were farther north. Layers of broken stratus clouds we had been flying over were now behind us. We had unlimited visibility, and I could see a single large column of very black smoke I thought was from Midway Island. Clayton Fisher, Bombart, posting of February 24th, 04, Re 265, 18, Re Hornet Air Group at Battle of Midway. Fisher was there, and his evidence cannot be easily dismissed. Waldron was convinced, however, that Ring's course was too far to the north. Around 0815, ENS Tappan, VS-8, and ENS Guillery, VB-8, heard Waldron when he broke radio silence. They recalled, in post-war interviews, that he told Ring that they were headed in the wrong direction and that he knew where the Japanese were. ENS Tallman, flying at the rear of VF-8, observed, like Woodson, the TBDs when they broke away to the left on a course of 234. Supposedly, this was in the direction of the IJN carriers, as given by the air plot officer at the time of takeoff. The break in radio silence was confirmed by LCDR Foster, Air Operations Officer on the Hornet, in his report of June 12, page 4, item 3, D. Bill Price, Bomber T, posting of August 8, 2003. The Japanese reports of the battle say that Waldron's formation came in from almost dead ahead, which would have been the case only if they had arrived on a southerly rather than a northerly course. Gay records that the moon was dead center in his windshield on this flight, which could have been the case only on a southwesterly course. By now, the accumulated evidence has convinced most historians, both professional and amateur, that Ring undoubtedly took something like a 265-degree course out about 225 miles, with Torpedo 8 breaking off about 0830, Fighting 8 breaking off about 0900 for lack of gas, and Bombing 8 turning left a little later by itself south toward Midway. The downed fighter pilots were picked up by the PBYs in the area plotted by Weishaupt, not in that given on the map attached to the Mitcher report. Ring never acknowledged that he took the 265-degree course, so his wide deviation from the bearing to Kido-Butai has been left hanging without a motive. His friends have said that he expected Nagumo to turn north and wanted to intercept him. Some have even suggested that his compass may have been faulty due to the amount of iron in bombs and ammunition he was carrying. In contrast, His critics have pointed out that he was leading a poorly trained air group from a new ship, was rusty as a pilot and navigator, and was probably excited in the circumstances and disoriented. Ring's enemies, and he had many then and now, say that he was trying to avoid the battle. A mimeographed chart from 1942, without provenance but likely from Torpedo Squadron 6, of TBD-1 fuel capacity and endurance shows in the torpedo-loaded column that the plane could carry only 96 gallons of gas with the 200-pound load, as compared to its full capacity of 180 gallons. The late Commander Tom Cheek, who had been a TBD pilot before he went to fighters, wrote in a private email that the plane was so underpowered that when you loaded it with over a ton of torpedo, the fuel weight had to be sharply reduced. At a speed of 100 miles an hour with a torpedo aboard and at sea level, meaning no climb for altitude, consumption is said on the chart to be 28 gallons per hour and endurance to be 3.4 hours. This means that the Hornet and Enterprise torpedo squadrons at Midway, launched 155 miles distant from Kido Butai, would be cutting it very close to get to the target and back. Of course, on the return trip, if there was one, without a torpedo, fuel consumption would go down, according to the chart, to 25 gallons per hour. But going in the other direction, some fuel would also have been used in forming up after takeoff, flying in formation, and reaching the 3,000 feet or so of altitude, absolutely needed to get up speed for the run-in to attack. During combat, balls-to-the-walls consumption would have gone up to 65 gallons an hour to achieve, on the chart only, a speed of 150 knots. Winds also have to be taken into account, and throughout the day, the American carriers, but not the Japanese, had to turn away from the enemy to head into the southeasterly light winds while launching the air group. There were a multitude of factors affecting gas consumption, including the acquired skill of the pilots in leaning out the mixture, which most of the Torpedo 8 pilots lacked. Put it all together, and the TBDs at Midway would have been worried about gas all the time they were in the air, and the 4 Enterprise and 2 Yorktown Devastators that made it back must have been running on empty at the end of their flight. Pilots, including myself, said Tom Cheek, leaned their fuel mixtures to the point that the engine was running on fumes rather than solid fuel. Both VT-3 pilots, the survivors, Estes and Call, told me later that they had been gauge-wise running on empty long before they sighted the carrier. Personal email, April 17, 2004. In his after-action report, Estes estimates that from being hit, he lost 55 gallons of fuel in his port tank, and he gives his time in the air as 3 hours from the time he took off until his fuel gauge read empty and he saw his home ship. Of course, 55 gallons is just a guess, and suspiciously identical to the contents of a barrel, so he may have just been rounding off. Call had serious engine trouble after being hit, and he gives his time in the air as 3 hours and 40 minutes. Waldron's citation for the Navy Cross says, "Grimly aware of the hazardous consequences of flying without fighter protection and with insufficient fuel to return to his carrier." George Gay says, "He, Waldron, certainly knew we were flying beyond our endurance to get back to our ship, but we might make it close to or even all the way to Midway Island." The skipper, 307. But others, notably John Lundstrom, do not believe that a TBD carrying a torpedo was on a kamikaze mission at Midway. Norman Sterry, a TBD pilot on the Lexington at Coral Sea, where the distance for the attack on the Shokaku on May 8 was 170 miles, said that his logbook showed that he was airborne for 5.1 hours, with a torpedo aboard for more than half of that time. He indicated that the Japanese were not where they were expected, and some searching was in order. He further stated that he could not possibly imagine taking off with anything less than a full load of fuel, even with a torpedo aboard. Sterry further volunteered that for one reason or another, Squadron CO Jimmy Brett didn't drop his torpedo on his first run at Coral Sea, so Sterry joined up on Brett's wing for a second run-in on the Japanese to deflect firepower, even though he'd dropped his own fish on his first run. He also told me that he wouldn't ever do that again. Norm Sterry became a doctor of medicine after he left the Navy. He is 87 years old and in reasonably good health. Frank De Lorenzo, Bommart, posting of August 16, 2004. It's hard to argue with a man who actually made one of those perilous runs, but as in so many things about Midway, the evidence is mixed. The weight of the evidence is that on every occasion when Devastators loaded with a torpedo took off on an attack of any distance over 100 miles, there was great concern about their endurance as well as about the efficiency of their torpedoes. By comparison, Kate, the Japanese torpedo plane, could carry 317 gallons in her tanks, which made possible the long-range attacks she regularly made without sweat.